Professor Dr. Zamri Razzi, Deputy Vice Chancellor Student Affairs, Universiti Malaya. Yang berusaha, Professor Dr. Chandran Somasundram, Head Coach, Universiti Malaya English Debating Team. Mr. Razani Abdul Rahim, Chief Assistant Registrar, Student Affairs Department, Universiti Malaya. Mr. Muhammad Alias Omar, Senior Assistant Registrar, Student Affairs Department, Universiti Malaya. Ms. Khairul Nur Ayuni, President of the Orator Council, Universiti Malaya, Session 2024-2025. Esteemed panel of judges, members of the organizing committee, respected guests and beloved participants. A very warm welcome to the grand final and closing ceremony of the Malaysian National Universities Debating Championship 2025. We are truly honored to host some of the brightest minds gathered here to celebrate the art of debate. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite the chair of the grand final to officially welcome and introduce our grand finalists. Please give them your attention.
Assalamualaikum and a very good evening to everyone. Welcome to the finals of the Malaysian National University Debating Championship 2025. On government, we have IIUM 1. On opposition, we have Malaya VAR. My name is Syakir. I'll be your chair for today. I'd like to introduce the panel. Paneling with me is Denise, Gauri, Ihsan, Nishant, Suraya, and Yugi. Couple of house rules before we begin. Please keep your cheering to a minimum. If you'd like to leave the room, please leave in between speeches. That's about it. On the motion, this house prefers the death of people over the death of culture. I invite Prime Minister. Here.
Oh, it's not on. You can see me, right? I want to start with a few shout-outs. First of all, I'm so elated to be here. I want to say thank you to IIUM, of course, first and foremost. If it wasn't for the fact that I came to IIUM, I would have never restarted my debate career and I would have never made it this far. I want to say thank you to my incredible team, which includes my incredible partner, Ibrahim. So thank you for supporting me. Thank you to Hanafie for being such an incredible teammate for about a year now. No matter what happens in our personal friendship, I think one thing that never ever changes is the fact that we are such good debaters when put together. I don't know if he's here. I also want to say thank you to Anas, who was my teammate for the bulk of my debate career. He has been very, very substantial to my progression as a debater, and I could never ever be more grateful. The last two people that I want to give my thanks to and shout out is my younger sister, who I hope never ever hears this, but I do truly love her. I do think she's such an incredible support system to me, no matter what I do. And lastly, to my arwah umi, who is not here anymore, but I think about her in everything that I do, and I'm wearing the last baju kurung, which was made from the kain from the last time that I ever went to Jackal with her to pick out a kain, and she was telling me that kain yang I pilih tak cantik. Everything I do is for my mother, and I just hope she's out there proud of me somewhere. That being said, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The cost of human lives has always been the primary excuse for colonization. The imbalance of power in favor of the aggressor, who assumes the continuous attacks will disincentivize revolution and attacks, is the very reason why we must allow this motion to pass. We've seen this multiple times in the past, between Russia and Ukraine, the Vietnam War with the US, Israel and Palestine. In every single case, the assumption of the oppressor is that the more and more you attack, the less and less they're going to retaliate, and therefore you can win this war. Note that oppression has always been the materialization of two cultures being unable to coexist, the culture of oppression and the culture of the people. We say with our stance that this narrative is the only pathway to resisting oppression, and therefore it must be defended. 3 things in my speech. First, illustration. Second, why this narrative will always involve the culture of the oppressed, which must be protected. And lastly, why the death of the people for the preservation of culture is justified. First, on illustrations. What is this debate about? I want to know. This maybe is one idiom with broad implications. It exists in other cultures. We've heard this before, not only in English culture saying death of people over death of culture, also in things like biar mati anak, jangan mati adat. There has always been this appreciation for very good reasons, which I'll explain later. Even if this is only literal, which we assume that opposition is going to push, we will win based on the precedent it sets and the people it protects. Two, what does the death of the people mean? It means that you are okay with the death of the people for the sake of the preservation of culture. Suffering, even to the extent of death, is worthwhile. This has always been most relevant in cases of resisting oppression, whether in terms of decolonization, the Palestinian freedom fighters, or the BLM movement. You are actively encouraged to risk it all for the sake of your cause and the safety of your people. Third, in terms of culture, this culture often entails your people's right to exist, the denial to be part of a forced assimilation, and all the cultures that you and your people practice being destroyed by this oppression. What does our work then look like? It looks like foregoing life for the sake of culture, the expectation that you put onto yourself and onto others to go all out against your oppressors, literally engaging in violence if necessary, fighting in court, UN, etc. Even if you risk repercussions from your oppressor. Note that this will be done by relatively rational actors. I don't think it's just going to be jumping in front of a bomb to make a message. It also entails things like activism and diplomacy, which is evidenced by a history of resistance, asking everyone to go all out for this cause. What then is side opposition expected to defend? It looks like foregoing this culture for the value of life. They must concede to the threats of repercussions. It looks like Palestine accepting this greater Israel plan by Trump rather than a two-state solution which protects their culture. It looks like Hamas completely disbanding and having no one to anymore represent the Palestinian culture. If I continue to my argument, sure.
Why do people from colonist countries believe that they are justified in colonization?
Very, very nice. My second argument is why the death of people for preservation of culture is justified. But first argument, then why the narrative will always involve the culture of oppressed, or why people think they're justified in colonization, so on and so forth. Note that aggressors often don't face this moral dilemma of whether or not this moral dilemma of which one you should choose. Their culture of oppression, which obviously they feel is justified because it's nice to be not nice sometimes, and also they have the capacity to protect both. In these oppressive states, the military is very strong, and they use that military as a medium to protect these individuals and this culture. We've seen this in the history of colonialism. The reason that the imperial era went on for so long is because the majority of colonized states lack the military capacity to fight back. But secondly, no, they feel that they are justified simply due to the fact that they are able to spread civilization. And civilization, as of status quo, we have all seen that this is in fact a co-opted term for the sake of justifying what is more evident, that is oppression. They believe that these people are under you, that their culture is under you, which makes you feel as if you are able to oppress them, and the extent of the violence that you use against them is worthwhile. Third reason that violence is in fact one of the best forms of coercion to compliance because of the widespread awareness of the value of life to each and every individual. No, countries like Israel, countries like the US and the Vietnam War, these people know of this. They know that people are unwilling to sacrifice, and most times that people ask themselves whether or not it's worth it to die for these causes and risk your bloodline ending. This awareness is what they co-opt in order to force people into assimilation. The impact is clear. The oppressor's best tool of oppression has always been the narrative that your life is more valuable than your culture and you should assimilate to prevent the harm towards your life. It will always be co-opted. It has always been co-opted. Second argument then, why is it that the death of people for the preservation of culture is in fact justified? First reason, no, because it always appears as a form of resistance. Colonialism has always been an oppression of culture which has been deemed uncivilized by Western biased standards. We've seen this in Timor-Leste being occupied by Indonesia for so many years because Indonesia believed that Timor-Leste was not developed enough, and they have this moral high ground to develop them through oppressive forces. It looks like British laws still staying in Malaysia because they don't believe Malaysia is good enough to figure out what civilization means on their own. Protecting this culture will always be a form of resistance against having yourselves, your rights, your morals erased. But second, know that death is better than bondage. The type of life that you will live in, given that you concede to the type of oppression in order to preserve your life, will always be oppressive, will always be at the wings of your abuser, will always be at the expense of your future generations, never ever seeing any form of liberty. We believe that the preferred life to live, it's always going to be either one of liberation or one of resistance, where you know that you are fighting against these people who have been so bad to you throughout your life. We're going to talk about the impacts now of us choosing death over the death of culture. Know that first, there are at least some form or some avenue of resistance for these individuals, something exclusive towards our side. If you believe in the death of people or the death of culture, there will always be somebody out there putting their all to defend these cultures. But secondly, the absence of this narrative means the absence of an adversary to this oppression. Because given this is the primary medium of obsession, there must be some sort of adversary to it. But third, note that this president really is quite broad, the president set by this messaging, because the core messaging is applicable in a wide range of forms of oppression. It looks like you shouldn't fear the risk of punishment. Luigi Mangione shouldn't fear the death penalty, because the cause of you fighting for all of those people who can never ever get access to healthcare is more worthwhile. You should not let your abuser win ever, because the cause that you're fighting in, regardless of the repercussions, is worth it. You should, in fact, choose to light yourself in fire, because you're no longer willing to live in a world where your country and you are still in an army which oppresses Gaza. The tipping point for resistance is dependent on the recognition that your selfhood is worth protecting to any extent. We win the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. To open the case of opposition, I invite Leader of Opposition, here.
Am I audible? Can, right? Okay. I just want to shout out to Vignesh and Raymond, because I think you guys have been very kind to me throughout this tournament, especially that I am very much a baby to leader compared to you guys. And also shout out to everyone at Malaya. Okay. In the Malayan trilogy, Anthony Burgess draws a direct dissonance between what it means or what encompasses Malay culture. On one hand, they adapt imperialistic narratives, aka I am the son of the soil, I have the utmost authority upon every single one of my constituents. But on the other hand, they actively hate things that are part of your lineage. I hate the fact that Bahasa Melayu derives from Sanskrit. I hate on Indian people despite being descended from the same islands. Why is this important, Judge? One, it proves that culture isn't inherently something definable or something inherently cementable or binary in that sense. Just because you're a certain way, you automatically have to subscribe to a certain outcome. I have two responses to Atifa then, because she comes up here and tells you that the death of the people is justified solely because you need to preserve your culture. Two responses. One, note that this oppression occurs symmetrically on both sides, because whatever reasoning they use to justify oppression in the first place, you propagate things on your side worse, because people inherently believe that my culture is worth superseding over actual people's lives, right? And the second thing that is this, you still didn't prove how you derive a specific mechanistical or tangible benefit that you can solely derive from the existence of culture then. In so far that I don't get any of this from Atifa's speech, I don't know how you can take this debate. Let's start with three pieces of framing then. Why inherently is culture something malleable? Note, culture is something inherently intangible because it relies on the current operational frameworks and ways you exist in that point of time, right? And that means then, note that like Malay culture that currently exists in the 21st century is explicitly and tangibly different from how it was previous millennia ago, right? No? And then the second thing then, under this, note that the current culture that exists now is an inherent manifestation that exists now due to a byproduct of people, right? Or the byproduct of people that have existed before this. Note, my culture is inherently influenced by like things like the era I exist in, people you surround yourself with, the genuine confinations that you exist in, all contribute to what necessarily encompasses what culture means. What am I proving then, Judge? Note that the death of people doesn't necessarily mean the death of culture, but the death of culture, it does not inherently mean the death of people, right? Because culture is something that can inherently metaphysically be resurrected and also tangibly be resurrected at the instance that one subset or one part of your culture dies. Second piece of framing then is how people inherently rely on your humanistic intuition, healthier, and it's overall like a net good on our side there. Because in some cultures do deserve to die and they are inherently bad, right? And because they actively promote these bad ideas, right? Think about things like your incel culture where they actively say, you know what, we should rape all women, or things like your patriarchal cultures, especially like in the Haniki, where they define women as two-legged wombs, right? All of these are definitive cultures that spread and propagate bad ideas that we definitely think deserve to die, right? And why do we think that, relying on your humanistic intuition is better? Because within your own rational rationality as a human, you are able to discern and decide for yourself if you want to alienate yourself from something that isn't necessarily proximate to you. The third thing under framing then is why inherently this intercultural competition happens worse on Gulf side then, because the fundamental reason why competition or intercultural conflict occurs is because one, people believe that this is something worth fighting for. If they believe that my culture alone supersedes every other culture and this is something worth preserving out of every other thing, right? And the third thing then, they believe that this is the end all be all and I don't exist within any other configurations of my identity outside of the fact that I belong to this culture. Let's get to the arguments then. First, why absent of culture can people still be happy on our side then? Most of the interactions you have within your daily life are inherently devoid of culture, right? Things like, okay, you going to play sports with your friend or participating in futile activities. You still derive some level of utility or extract some kind of marginal benefit from this that explicitly happens onto you that isn't dependent on the fact that this is intrinsically tied to the existence of culture, right? And then the second thing under this then, not a lot of things that we do are inherently underpinned or intertwined by culture, right? Things like your daily interactions, you attending like your university or just general communal infrastructures doesn't mean that they don't necessitate that culture is the sole integral reason why these things, one, exist, and second, need to rely on in order to functionally operate in the long run then. The second thing under this then is when you choose to resist something, you choose to resist it because of the people, right? Not because of some ambiguous and intangible reason that culture inherently defines it as. Why does this tie back to the characterization then, Judge? No, because culture is inherently something intangible and malleable. It's something that you cannot view, it's something that you cannot touch. What you can view is that people inherently exist in front of your eyes, that people have flesh and bones and blood running through their veins. You now have a larger incentive on our side then to fight into and buy against things like oppression, right? Because you view these people as people who are worth living. You don't define Palestinian culture as things that the media has like inherently, intangibly defined it as like watermelons or headscarves, right? You believe and you view this like the worth of their lives and to the fact that they integral human beings that adjust to your own calculus in order to sympathize them. The second question I'm answering then is why are people a prerequisite to culture? Because culture is something inherently malleable. It is something that can change over time. Even in a point in time in which a specific part of your culture is dead, that aspect can still be resurrected in the long run, right? The comparative on Gulf then is that people cannot come back right after they're dead. People ultimately, your descendants are going to yearn for you. People are going to miss you when you're gone. What does this establish then, Judge? People, people need to live in order to guarantee the ability for you to live and tell your tales and ensure that your culture that you're so dying to preserve actually can live on and that your lineage is going to carry this on throughout millennia that's coming, right? The second thing that happens on Gulf then is that you integrally penetrate this culture of hopelessness within your communities because things are now inherently viewed as in a binary way, right? That if I deviate even the slightest bit from my culture, I am ultimately going to be alienated from this. I'm no longer going to be my own individual agent that can operate healthily and navigate things in my own life on my own terms. The second, I don't even know what question this is. Third question I'm answering that is culture the basis of our identity? The answer is inherently no, because what do you inherently derive fulfillment within your life is that the fact that people around me exist, the things I participate in my daily life exist. All of these aspects that you futilely operate on within your life is existing independent of culture, right? And why absent of culture then can you still enjoy your life? Because only on op then do you still derive benefits from other facets of your life that aren't intrinsically reliant on culture then. Note that this is an important priority shift then, because one, you prioritize things like your own well-being and your own mental calculus, and this is the requisite on the fact that culture specifically hyper-focuses on the happier moments or like more beautiful aspects of that culture, right? And second, that people inherently have their own subjective views of what culture is. It's only worse on Gulf because the way you assimilate or the way you subscribe to your means of viewing the world is inherently in a binary. I don't care necessarily if Malay culture dies after I die because my life inherently matters more, and I, so as a person, exist outside of the confinations of the culture that wants to impose upon myself. All those reasons, all.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. To continue the case of Gov, I invite Deputy Prime Minister Syakir.
start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in my speech. Number 1, is culture original and does that matter? Because Azureen kind of cares whether culture is original, whether she eats nasi lemak or went to the mawar, I don't really care. But secondly, would absence of culture actually ensures happiness, like what opposition is trying to claim? But thirdly, how the narrative manifests onto bringing benefits to the actual oppressed, the actual case that we're trying to bring, that opposition is not trying to cater at all. First, is culture original and does that matter? Azureen and opposition sides told you that culture is a mix, therefore culture is intangible, therefore it doesn't really matter. Note that number 1, culture is what people say it is, or culture is what people care about. So if the community thinks it is valuable, then they need to be protected. It doesn't matter where it comes from, it doesn't matter if it was a mix or it like came from Bahasa Melayu, came from Sanskrit, it doesn't matter, as long as it's something that is re-celebrated, it's something that needs to be protected. But not that it does not matter if a culture, but yeah, basically the conclusion, what it entails is that it needs to be, if it's something that is celebrated, it needs to be protected. But second, would absence of culture actually ensures happiness? Know that this is definitely not true, because Azureen can talk about the random nitpicking examples of culture, like you going to the university doesn't actually affect culture at all, but that's definitely a lie. You order nasi lemak using Bahasa Melayu, that's actually a culture. You use your duit ringgit, that's all culture. But not that is not the case from opposition side to begin with. We're talking about wiping an entire nation out of their own identity. Why would you talk about some random protecting your baju kurung? We really don't care about that. Atifa's speech was never responded to. This is why Palestinian wants a two-state solution. They don't want to join with a greater Israel because they want their culture to be protected. Sure.
So there's tension in your case. The determinant for the determinant for fighting oppressors is always culture and nothing else. Why then is it the determinant of oppressors to oppress not culture as well?
No, I understand the fact that, okay, I'll get to this in my arguments, actually aligns with my third point in my speech, how the narrative manifests onto bringing benefits to the oppressed. In this argument, I'll tell you and answer your POI on how having a narrative that is this narrative that is propagated will actually help the most vulnerable in 3 ways. Number 1, it will be putting a huge importance on culture to begin with. Not that the new generation does not realize the importance of culture, and we always make fun of culture. Like in status quo, we have lagu raya that is turned into EDM, we have baju Melayu that is transparent, we have baju kurung that is singkat, right? So these are all like Gen Z like misappropriation of culture. But why is this bad? Because of 3 reasons, right? One, know that these are your contributions of your great ancestors to begin with. It needs to be remembered and celebrated. But thirdly is the underappreciation and adoption of other culture, thinking that this is something that is okay. But why then culture is important in status quo, in the past and in modern world? 4 reasons. 1, know that it shows identity, it shows who you really are, it shows who you are, where you are from, and it makes sure that you are as a person very unique. But 2, it's to protect the dignity of your country or where you're from. But thirdly, it's opposing neo-colonialism, right, and ensures culture appreciation. This means that you are distinct from your other people. This is something that I only have as a person from Kuantan or a person from Kelantan. The fact that I can kecek Kelantan is something that I want to protect, and it's something that you should be celebrating. But 4th, know that we need to celebrate and appreciate the hard work of our ancestors that fight literally to protect the name of the Malays, the name of the whole Malaysian identity. But second reason, right, note that we actually create spirit to fight against neo-colonialism to begin with. Note that neo-colonialism is so prevalent in status quo, from customary laws practiced in Malaysia to capitalism to policy shaping still controlled by the UK, and also all of this propaganda is happening in status quo, right? Only on our side, we create the active incentive to fight against these developed Western countries when they try to influence you. Because this narrative on our side, what it creates like your culture is more important than your life. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go and kill yourself to protect your nasi lemak or to protect your baju kurung, right? But it just put a very important narrative onto your culture, because we can no longer tolerate or make jokes or think that it's funny that people are allowing to to culturally appropriate our culture, right? You know that this narrative reminds people to fight against outside influence, and it serves as a reminder to fight against injustice. You know that this is the only time when people are actually angry in order to create awareness and create the reaction necessary to actually protect the people on ground. Because again, we're not talking about just protecting some random culture that Azureen is talking about. I hope that second and third speaker can actually engage with Atifa's case. I don't know if they were listening. It's literally about wiping a whole entire nation of their identity and of their nationality, thinking that that's okay. That is not okay. Know that only on our side social movements would be better heard and better recognized when you realize that there's something that these Western societies or these other people are trying to take away from you. And when we say that protect it with your life, this is when you actually care about it, and you as an individual person in the country will not be like opposition, not literally caring, just go to university, talk to your friends and go back home, not thinking that there's a greater part that you're trying to protect. And only on our side, change and buy-in is more likely to happen. And before I move on, sure, Raymond.
Do Western countries have culture?
Yeah, Western countries have their own culture, but that's not what we care, right? Oh, okay, sure. If you want to say that they're trying to protect their own culture, but sure, we're looking at scenarios such as Israel literally genociding Palestine in order to take away their culture. This is the scenario that we're talking about. The fact of going into another country, shooting a lot of tons of people, that is not something to protect your culture. You're literally encroaching above someone else. And on our side, only this debate should happen when there is an actual threat to your culture, not you wanting to attack other people. That's simply not justified. That reason that only on our side you would garner better support from institutions, because you get to show to the world that you actually make the importance out of your own culture and that it needs to be fight for. Only on our side, we identify as a Malaysian, you identify as a Palestinian, the language that you speak as a Sudanese, your land as a citizens of Congo, the traditions that you have as a Bangladeshi. All of this is only recognized on our world when you think and you want to protect it really well and actually put the importance into it. And the importance of culture only happen on our side. The opposition will always say there's nothing important. Be charitable and engage with our case.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech. To continue the case of OP, I invite Deputy Leader of Opposition, Syakir.
I just want to thank a few people. I want to thank Vignesh, I want to thank Azureen, I want to thank Malaya for making me who I am. I want to thank Sunway, I want to thank Shireen, Chenzu, Andrea, all these people that also helped in my journey as well. These are people that are very important to me, people that I hold dear to my heart. I also want to thank my friends, my families for being very supportive of me in this sport. When my grandfather died, I did remember him for having a samurai sword. I remember him for feeding me radish soup when I was young, for reading me bedtime stories before I go to sleep. Those are the memories that I hold dear. They are not necessarily that of cultural memories as well. The issue of this team is that if culture is as important as they say, that is why Israel refused to back down and negotiate. That is why they continue to perpetrate the genocide. Because if you're able to identify as Palestinian, if you're able to identify yourself as Malaysian, you similarly are able to identify yourself as Israeli, you're able to identify yourself as British, you're able to identify yourself as bad cultures as well. Which means that they can't just engage in a particular scenario or context whereby culture is only good or for the most vulnerable. Culture also exists for those that are part of the colonization, part of the majoritarian race, part of individuals cultures that are not necessarily the best. Insert culture, gamer culture, Israeli culture are not necessarily the best kinds of culture that they ought to defend under their side of the house as well. The second thing here is on happiness. They want to say that after all this, you can't be happy. But that's not true. There are still biological desires for you to want happiness. We give individuals the agency and the flexibility to choose what makes them happy. If I feel happy without having to have a culture, if I feel happy with having debate threads that are necessarily devoid of culture, that is something that's important to me as a result. So we give individuals the agency to go out the confines of their culture and to find something else that's more meaningful for them. The first thing I'm talking about here is about cultural interaction. As EPM concedes, culture is perceived not just within the community, but also about how groups and the public, and the general public interact with the community. And the issue with this is that culture is oftentimes enforced and also informed through prejudice that are very hard to get rid of. This is, for example, black culture, African culture, or Indian culture being associated with violence, or the fact that Chinese culture is associated with eating dogs, for example, which means that oftentimes it's those negative traits that are more overwhelming and oftentimes reinforces our conception of that culture. The reason why is that oftentimes individuals are biologically predisposed to risk aversion. They are scared and they are fearful of their culture, therefore they have no reason to engage in their culture because their view culture to be inherently bad already. But secondly, it's oftentimes reinforced within your own echo chamber as well. The fact that you can hear people talking about these things means that that particular view of that culture is also reinforced within these circles as well. The second thing, and this is a very important part here, is that the requirement to impose inferiority and superiority for other culture as well. Your culture shining over another culture comes at the expense of that particular culture as well. The fact that oftentimes is the fact that you force people to conform to culture even though they don't want to. The issue with this theme is that the measure of how do you make a culture superior or inferior are still based on the measure that they say. A culture is more civilized, the British culture is more civilized, that's why they justify colonialism. The fact that Malay culture is deemed to be uncivilized is why they are able to justify and say that we get rid of their culture. Meaning that if it's true that culture exists, it means that culture is weaponized for the worst kinds of conflicts under their side of the house. But secondly, they just can't debate in the context of the oppressed, but also on how the oppressor will also use culture as well, for things like war as well. Because under their side of the house, that is the most proximate and also the most influential narrative in order for them to engage in conflict, to engage in war without having to back down. Because to them, if it's true that culture is so important, they also want to preserve their culture at the expense of another culture. The second thing is on the comparative. We just don't view individuals through their cultural lens. Rather, we judge and review them based on their actions, their views, their friends, who they hang out with, etc. Things that dictate our livelihoods are just a lot more meaningful manner. For example, your job, your hobby, your education, these things are more meaningful. They give you money, they give you an ability to sustain your own livelihoods as well. Which means that if you don't have culture, that is perfectly fine. There are other things that we're able to resort to in order for us to make us happy. The second thing here is that if a culture dies for the sake of survival, there's a valid decision for the sake of safety. I feel sad when my Malay friends die, not because they're Malay, but because they're my friends. I have precious memories associated with them. That's why I cherish those memories. But similarly, it's also the fact that culture makes people a lot more narrow-minded and consumes a very large part of their identity. You can't diversify outside your culture or get out of that culture even if you wanted to. It's the fact that often if you're an Israeli, you are forced to conform with that culture. Because if you don't, you are deemed to be like a fake Jew, or you're deemed to be non-Israeli, for example. Which they are forced to be part of that culture, and there's no way for you to get out of that culture as well. The last thing here is that oftentimes you also feel shame over your culture. You feel guilt when you leave the culture as well. Literally, oftentimes the fight that they talk about, our fight over culture, is the fact that Ukrainian culture is seen as part of Russian culture. It's the fact that Israeli culture continue co-opting Palestinian culture as well. Which means that it requires often that the fact that the existence of culture instigates conflict, instigates war, instigates the kinds of things that this team talks about. Lastly, if you lose, it doesn't mean that culture prevails. People laugh at your culture. People see your culture as a failure, see it as a sign of misery, of death, of suffering. Which means that even when you continue that culture, the way that people perceive that culture isn't always inherently positive. People affiliate certain culture negatively, and this team doesn't really engage with that. Before that, sure.
Yeah, can you give me one historical example where these worst kinds of cultures or these oppressors have had to deliberate between life and culture?
So in most instances, it's the fact that if culture dies, that's perfectly fine. So our example would be, if insect culture dies, that's perfectly fine. If the patriarchal norms die, that's perfectly fine. There are various cultures that are justified in dying. This thing doesn't know as to why the only kinds of culture that will exist are the good kinds. But secondly, as we are going to explain why the death of people matters more in this debate. Often, these people have their own independent lives, and these deaths are unique to each and every individual. You You may be fine with my mom dying for culture, but I don't. I love my family for the aspect of culture as well. Perhaps I don't care about Vicky's brother, but he does care about his brother. So there are all individual reasons why I should care about them. To use the unique lives of these families, to use the unique lives of these individuals to instrumentalize something that is inherently vague is disgusting in my opinion. But secondly, it's the fact that this notion of resistance is not exclusive. People resist against oppression not because of culture, but because it's a material harm to their livelihood, but not a cultural one. You resist against oppression because you are cut off access to healthcare, you have no wages, your family died, and that's why you resist. It's not the reason why culture is the tipping point for you to want to resist against oppression. You resist against oppression because in most instances you are cut off from the things that will give you material benefit. The fact that you don't have access to healthcare or education are reasons why you fight against these things, not necessarily that of culture. But secondly, if a Palestinian dies and if a Palestinian can eat bread, for example, it doesn't matter what bread he eats. It could be a pita, a white bread, or prata, for example. It doesn't really matter in this debate. The fact that someone are able to live and survive is already good enough for them because they are able to find other avenues for them to be happy about. The last thing here is on the worst case of bondage. Maybe you are like bonded to a life of slavery, but you are still able to find hope, you're able to find meaning, you're able to find a struggle that you're able to resonate with at our very worst case. So even when you die, all your mental faculties no longer exist, but comes with the collateral of other people feeling sad at your behalf. Your family will mourn for you, everyone else will feel sad, and they can't move on from that particular life as well. Which means that oftentimes there's a biological desire for you to want to find happiness. Even outside of culture, you are still able to survive. You are still able to find meaning within that life as well. So maybe culture is something that's important, but for the vast majority of individuals, like this thing says, the Gen Z people, culture to them is not that important anymore. They find other potential avenues that will allow them to be happy as well. That's the key conception that you need to carry within this debate. For all those reasons, a second time in a row.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. To conclude the substantive portion of Gov, I invite Government Whip. Here.
Alright, so hi guys, I'm Ibrahim. This is my first major finals. Finals aside from the reason for M, which I was finalist for this, but I think this is a proper finals. Not to put down MLDP and basically, okay, sorry. National finals. Okay, sorry. But what I'm trying to say is that I'm extremely happy and grateful to be able to make it to these finals. I'm proud to be assisted by two wonderful teammates, one of which is my partner, alongside my good friend Hanafie, which has been with me through thick and thin. This is my second competition with me. I'd also like to acknowledge my previous teammates. I know I have been a bundle of frustrations before this, but I am where I stand today because of the fact that I was able to team up with you guys and learn from my mistakes previously. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my family. They have been my number one supporters. Even though sometimes they tell me I debate too much, thankfully it's like translated into something lah. Okay. So without further ado, I'll record my speech really quick. What is culture? Culture is more than just things like gamelan or dikir barat or even kuih raya. It's about memories and the feelings that are attributed to these things that are represented within culture. So this can look like the very same food that your family feeds you, the very same clothes that you wear when you go to traditional places. The representation of your identity as a whole is inseparable from your culture, because although in certain instances this culture may seem harmful, it is a part of you. And just because Azureen says like Sanskrit and same islands as the Indians is something that is extremely harmful, I don't think that's something that is essentially harmful. The ability for you to derive happiness from the fact that you are a representative of an entire culture and an identity is something that is very beneficial under our side. Secondly, oppressors similarly tend to impose culture upon individuals. Yes, the oppressors also weaponize them, but bad cultures will defend themselves anyways, or rather impose themselves anyways, and rather the oppressed have a way to defend themselves from these oppressive cultures. Necessarily, the ability for you to have culture then is determinant upon you having this identity within yourselves that you're going to want to protect. Because if it is synonymous with yourself, then if your culture dies, essentially the memory of yourself dies, the memory of your loved ones die, and the ancestors which have fought so hard to protect you and ensure that you are alive today goes with the culture, essentially. If Vicky or Vignesh wants to QI that the determinant for fighting oppressors is more than cultures, I'd like you to note, dominating others to force you to coalesce through things like gold, gospel, and glory is culture. Because anything that is an imposition of your identity upon another is an imposition of your culture, having established that this is synonymous. So you die, you leave behind the lived experiences you have, i.e. your culture. Opposition says to this three things. Firstly, they refuse to engage, so they don't really say much, but they refuse to engage on culture being synonymous. Raymond, even to an extent, and I respect him for this, is able to reminisce about the meals that his family made. But it's exactly because of this that this is synonymous with culture, because you remember the things that your family has done with you. The radish soup that you had is probably a remainder or reminiscent of the culture that you had. Secondly, China eat dog. People hyperfixate on the worst kinds of cultures. I also would tend to agree that people hyperfixate on the better parts of culture, because you can see people who are of different races from you are willing to wear things like baju Melayu, like cheongsams, like sampus, etc., to appreciate the culture that other people have and to integrate and to relate with these people on a better level. And thirdly, you are forced to integrate and not like Israelis being shamed for not properly acknowledging Israelis. We never disagreed that there are harms, but we told you that in light of the fact that there are these harms, it is important that we protect this culture to allow these individuals of the oppressed nature to have a weapon to defend themselves. And I just like to note, if you want to see that culture doesn't exist as a form of identity, things as small as even asrama culture, if you iron a Milo, you get a Milo's bar, I think people will be like, oh, good afam culture. It's something that needs to be recognized under today's debate. Issue number 2 then, which side better protect people? But before that, Raymond.
So, when my grandfather tells me bedtime stories before I go to sleep, what culture is that? Is it Chinese culture, Malay culture, Indian culture? What culture is that?
Yeah, so there are things that you are able to distinguish that are and are not culture. If there is someone that is in your society that kills someone else, just because they are part of your culture doesn't mean that murder is a part of your culture. There are bad parts that cannot necessarily are connected with your culture. I think the lived experiences that you have can and cannot be culture as well. But the important thing to note that for a large majority of it, especially with the reasons I provided before this, it is synonymous. Issue number 2, which side better protects people. This debate happens with the oppressed, because the oppressor has the oppressors have the capacity to both protect their culture and their people. Because by virtue of Atifa mentioning military force, things like you being able to impose your gospel, gold, and glory onto other individuals require you to be able to not have to deliberate or not have this moral dilemma between protecting your lives and your cultures. The important thing to notice then is that firstly, under opposition side, there is no protection for these individuals. Even if they were to say that China eat dog is bad because demonization of the culture happens, the ability for that to happen is, although we trade off that it does happen, the ability on a larger scale is better able to protect these individuals from being mentally from being mentally enslaved, for them to be able to emancipate themselves, for them to be able to rise up and fight against these oppressive cultures. Government has told you comparatively, firstly, that there's an imposition of laws that happen. British law, like for example, the sodomy law that exists under status quo in Malaysia is an imposition of British laws in the past. So if you want to say that Malaysia is potentially regressive, the fact that the British have came unto us and imposed these laws is the very reason why we are stagnating unto now, because we're scared to want to like bubalkan or remove repeal these laws that have previously come. Necessarily then secondly, forcing of one culture as bad. We understand that this imposition of laws is something that is immensely harmful until today. So if you are not willing to trade off the lives of some individuals, the life of all future generations are at jeopardy because you subject them to these laws and this imposition of other individuals' cultures, which is already told these laws are likely to be an imposition of cultures, then these individuals are not going to be very good, not going to be well off for the future. No, thank you. Third issue then, who enables the oppressor more? We've already proved to you that oppressors are self-sufficient, so just by virtue of that, governments told you firstly that the ability to weaponize and protect the culture is dependent on the ability for you to collectivize against an oppressive force through this culture that you all share. Yes, maybe individuals care about their family members dying. Maybe there is a care of people dying per se, but the ability for you to care about your culture and the individuals within your community that share that culture and the need for you to want to prevent that from being lost, i.e. because all of those other people share those same lived experiences and cultures with you is important. Because if the oppressed continues to oppress, you're not going to have a weapon to oppress them on the opposition side because you're just protecting people's lives necessarily. So it's as opposed to collectivizing because of this, you collectivize and save your family members instead of saving all of the other people which are relevant to your culture. So, therefore, in the instance that you are locked to bondage, you are unable to emancipate yourself because you are prioritizing your life and you're not willing to retaliate and resist the oppression that is happening unto you. Only under government are you able to emancipate yourselves through collectivizing and ensuring that everyone is able to get through and the culture is able to be protected.
Thank you, Gauri, for that fine speech to include the substantive portion of opposition and by opposition with Syakir.
Starts with a P, it ends with an I. We call him Pagri, P-A-G-R-I.
Can you guys hear me like this? Can everyone hear me? Wow. Is this better?
Yes.
Judges, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Okay, I don't know. I think I don't know close now. Okay, a couple of shout outs really quickly. So, first up, I am going to shout out everyone here from the Malaya Debate Club. You guys have been extremely supportive to us. The friends that I've made along the way in debating, I think that all of you guys are amazing. And at times where I question where my sense of community comes from, I think the strongest friends that I've made is through debating. Beyond that, also, of course, shout out my teammates. Thank you for helping me reach my first MNU finals and my first national finals in general. That's amazing. Thank you guys so much. Special shout out to Raymond because he puts up with my nonsense a lot. And special shout out to all the people who make life really meaningful, both in the good ways and the bad ways. You are all part of the human experience that I have, and thank you so much. Something that very eloquently clashes with this government's case today is that I wanted to wear a Spider-Man mask to finals. I wanted to do this because of the deep ties that I feel towards the character and what he emotionally represents. However, I am told not to do this because it is seen as unmanly. It is seen within the patriarchal norms within our society to be something that we ought not to do. I am told within the norms of formality and the culture of formality that this is something that we ought not to do. To what end then does culture serve us? If not, the only means that we should be living by should be the ones that make us the most happy, make us feel like we have lived a memorable life, make us feel like we are not under the constant shackles of oppression. The failure of his government team in today's debate is to recognize the permeability of culture into how it transcends individuals' ability to live, how it stops and impedes you from expressing yourself, and how it forces individuals into a lifelong status of oppression. If they wanted to argue on oppression, the oppressive norms that we live in are oppression enough. But I want to note two things before I get into the clashes in my speech. The first is that colonialism just isn't the whole debate. Yes, we can say that it's an extremely important part of the debate and its consequences can happen, but I want to call out the tension here. Because if resistance to colonialism only occurs as a product of individuals having ties to their culture, then presumably the imposition of colonialism for the same reasons that you believe death to yourself over death of culture leads colonists to believe that it is preferred that people die, Native Americans die, Indians who worship quote-unquote pagan gods die over allowing their culture to preserve because you view these cultures as insignificant relative to yours. The second is that it's just a question of why ought people die for their culture? This isn't something that is answered. Presumably, even within the most deplorable states of the world, the reason why you choose to die for a resistance like a Palestinian living in Gaza isn't because your culture tells you that you ought to do this. It is because you believe in your sovereignty, because you believe in your freedom, because you believe in things that are proximate to you and define your ability to live. All of these things are alien from culture, yet there's no engagement to this. But let's be charitable. Let's make the first clash about can we resolve colonialism better. They say, yes, they can resolve colonialism better because you are oppressed and now you feel like you must fight. Second, because the only tipping point is culture. And third, that you can fight neo-colonialism better. Why is this untrue? Number one, because the idea of a culture being the a foremost thing that you think about is the exact reason why colonialism occurs. They say we don't engage in today's debate, but they never engage it with this comparative that comes about Raymond and Azureen's speech. The idea that the reason why colonialism occurs is that you believe that people deserve to die if it is for the preservation and propagation of your culture. But the second is the weaponization of these narratives. Raise your hand, guys, if you believe that the Crusaders believed that they were colonizing people and not that they were protecting their culture and protecting Christianity. Wow, no one raised their hand. Raise your hand if you believe that Israelis believe that they are committing a genocide and not that they are individuals who are preserving Jewish culture. The point here is that these narratives are always weaponized by oppressors as well. So if you want to argue that culture is the tipping point, it unlocks two harms in the debate. The first, it means that every instance of oppression occurred because individuals believed that they were protecting their culture. But number two, in absence of this, even if you get greater degrees of scale of protection on their side, that doesn't matter. Because the prerequisite towards engaging in these nefarious acts of violence is the belief that you're protecting your culture in the first place. That you rather people die than let your culture be quote-unquote lost, whatever that means. The second thing I want to talk about is that resistance occurs regardless. And this is the second level of response that I want to say. The idea here is that resistance towards an oppressor is something that occurs uncircumstantial to whether or not culture matters to you. Presumably, you resist colonialism because you don't like the idea of a foreign actor who imposes legislation on your state as something that is good. You don't think that that's a good value to uphold, and that's why you resist it. But presumably as well, this is also why you support people who are not part of your culture. Things like the support of Palestinians in Gaza, things like the support of individuals all across the world who are oppressed, things like how you support women, things like how you support black people, things like how you support Indians when Winston Churchill was oppressing us. All of these things occur not because you believe in the cultural value of their lives, but because you believe that these are lives that are worth preserving. This is the crucial nuance that this government team does not get. The way here is simple. Maybe people resist to a greater scale on their side. Maybe you fight against your oppressor even more. But you fight for things that are inherently not tied towards your livelihood. You fight for things that even if they are from oppressive structures, don't impact you. On our side, the point where it impacts your ability to humanistically express yourself, the point where it impacts your ability to have a livelihood and determine the legislation of your state, the operations of your state, is the point where you fight. That is the delta that we are clearly winning on. Before I get to the second clash, POI Silani.
Yeah, what is the extent of resistance that can occur on your side if you're going to stop the moment your life is at threat?
One, this just doesn't listen to my speech because they explain why the probability of this occurring is just so much lower on our side. But two, even if it does occur, what we say is that the extent of resistance needs to be weighed against the extent of oppression. The problem is on your side, the extent of oppression for the reasons of gold, glory, and God is tied to the inherent belief that you ought culture. That in a world where this debate operates on the ideas that you ought to preserve your culture and allow people to die, you continue to allow this to happen. Listen to our speech, listen to our analysis, because we are arguing for the fact that this is what happens. No engagement from this opposition team. Government team. The second thing I want to talk about is, can we be happy? No, they don't really contend on this. So insofar as they prove that the impacts here are presumably quite great towards an individual level, means we win on the greatest scale of the debate, which is individual self-actualization, the ability for you to express yourself. They say culture is good and you ought to preserve it regardless of circumstance. Second, that culture is so intertwined with yourself that you ought to protect it at all costs. The first response I have to this is that all the examples and all the reasons that you tie emotions towards things aren't because of the culture behind it. You don't believe that your father feeding you chicken soup is tied to Indian culture. You value that memory and value that experience because of the fact that it made you feel happy, made you feel comforted, made you feel safe. These are the reasons why people cherish these memories. Not because my father is Indian, my father could be Chinese for all I care, and I could have been drinking like, I don't know, chikute or something like that. But that isn't the point of it. The point is that it makes you happy because it ties towards who you are as an individual. The weighing on this clash is simple. You can be happy because you can be your truest self. You don't have to conform to patriarchal norms, towards the norms of what it means to be an Indian. You can move into and out of cultures at free will, whenever you want. So judge, this debate might be about whether people dying or culture dying is important. But there is no faith worse than a faith where you are forced to live, not die, but for ideals, for values, for systems and livelihoods that you don't inherently stand by. That's why we win. That's why this motion must fall.
Thank you, opposition, for that speech. To conclude the entire opposition case, I invite opposition reply. Here.
I support Palestinian cause not because of their culture, but rather because I saw a father holding the corpse of his dead daughter, a mother mourning over a makeshift grave of her son, a kid without his life digging through the rumors of genocide. We don't value culture for the sake of culture. We value them because of who is behind those culture. We value them because they are humans. The issue with this team is that they want to instrumentalize our human lives. Each of us are simply pawns for the advancement of culture. But what does that culture truly mean? If I feel shameful for being Chinese, because people keep saying that I eat dogs, for example, do I feel proud of their culture? Rather, I detach from the culture and I find other meaningful ways for me to live a happy life. This team here concedes that ultimately culture is something that's very important. But because something is very important and personal to you, when you see it mocked, when you see it being humiliated, when you see it being demonized, how would you react? You either react with shame or you act militant, you resist against that particular impression of your culture as well. So under this house, the very key simple issue here is that they want to talk about conflict and colonization. The issue here is that we explain to you as why oftentimes conflicts arise because of culture. In fact, that culture becomes a motivating factor for people to continue pursuing on the genocide, for instance, is why culture is something that's inherently bad. Because they say as to why this can be good culture or vulnerable culture. But in most instances, the same way as why there's a power asymmetry between those of the victors and the losers, the same thing applies to culture as well, whereby there are going to be more influential culture and cultures that are a lot less relevant as well. Meaning they don't really prove as to why the context of this debate ought to be debated in the context of only good culture, when we put it that in most instances, it's likely going to be bad culture manifesting, or people perceiving this culture to be in bad ways because of the preconceived notions that have formed about a particular culture. So, outside the house, you don't need these kinds of things. We prove as to why life is still worth living. They prove that culture might be important, but they don't prove that it's something that is worth dying over. We prove that even if absent of culture, you are still able to live a meaningful life. You're still able to find friends and families for you to feel safe and reassured as well. Meaning that if they want to talk about how culture is important, sure, go ahead. The issue with these things, they don't prove it's something that is worth dying over, to see your friends and your families dying over as well. Because what we were able to prove to you was quite simple. In the vast majority of instances, I care about the lives around me. I care about the fact I care a lot about my friends. I care a lot about my family. If they die for culture, I don't know what that means for me. I don't know whether or not something that's very valuable. But when they do die, my memories of them are not of their culture, but rather the time that I spent with them as sessions talking and laughing, the time that I spent talking with them at nationals, for instance, the time that I spent like eating pizza with them, eating at Safwan, for example, those are the memories that I hold dear. These are things that are intrinsically non-cultural, but we hold those values to be important as well. They can claim all they want, their culture can be used as a front against resistance, can be a fight against oppression. The issue of this thing is that resistance occur for various other reasons. They don't prove that culture is the tipping point as to why suddenly people are going to fight for these things as opposed to material harm. People can collectivize around these things as well. They don't prove as why it must occur in this particular context. The last thing I'll talk about here is that when you are starving, when you are rotting in prison, doesn't matter what kind of bread you eat. Doesn't matter what songs are you listening to. Presumably not. You care more about your livelihoods. When you die, it's not your culture that flashes before your eye. It's the memories that you hold dear. It's the memories that you cherish. The good and the bad that happen within your life. Those are the things that will likely flash before your eyes when you die. This proves that culture is all that important. There are good cultures and bad cultures. So we're able to win on three fronts. First, they were able to debate in a more general context of why, even when culture does exist, it's not something that's always necessarily beneficial for the individual. Secondly, we were able to explain as to why culture is the catalyst for conflict. While also conflict occurs as a result of cultural competition between one another, the need to impose one culture over another. This means that we can always look at the good things of culture. If that is the case, why do we need things like state-enforced racial reintegration program? Because presumably, if that is true, we don't need these things anymore. The reasons why we need someone to force us to want to reintegrate is because of the fact that we look at culture in a way that's prejudiced, in a prejudiced land, in a lens that's racist. That is why this team can't win. Because for all the reasons or whatever, you don't prove as why it's worth the death of people as well. Malaya lost their last finals. Hopefully I'm here to reclaim it back.
Thank you, opposition reply for that speech. To conclude this debate as a whole, I invite government reply. Here.
Hello. I'm quite ashamed to admit that I forgot one very important shout out. Thank you, Allah. Oh, thank you again. Yeah, thank you, God, for all the opportunities you've given me. I'm so grateful. Three clashes. First, a meta clash on where the debate actually exists and why our side is more relevant in general. Second, who better facilitates resistance, and third, who facilitates oppression more. First, on where the debate exists. This is a meta clash because I want to point out the opposition has a relatively soft stance. They have continually been trying to center the debate around these more general forms of culture. Things like nasi lemak and incel culture. I want to note the type of cultures that we are talking about are signifiers of your existence. Things which determine whether or not your people exist or whether they're just a subculture or a small group of people in a different country. I want to note this debate is about the instances in which culture and life can coexist. There is no incel out there who has to debate or deliberate between whether or not they should die or rape a woman. This is not a culture that they will die for anyways because nobody is killing them. This is going to be about the victims of ethnic cleansing. This is about the victims of structural oppression. The moments in which your nationality is threatened from no longer existing on the face of this planet, this is when it matters. Why are the worst kinds of culture not necessarily part of the debate? And I think they largely ignored the Prime Minister's speech in which we already dealt with this. First, know that the worst kind is often going to be from states with more power. They don't necessarily face this moral conflict because their culture and the life of their people can coexist. They have the capacity to protect both. Second, they will use this culture as a defense anyways. They never told you what particular avenue victims have as an adversary to this. We believe that Israel is going to say that this is the promised land of their people anyways. We would rather Palestinians also have an avenue to believe that their land matters also. Second hashtag. Who better facilitates resistance? Because opposition comes forward and tells you that the motivation for resistance is material and tangible. They say that the value for human life makes you resist. The extent of this, I want to note, is incredibly low because the threat of your death deters further resistance. So what sort of resistance are you necessarily going to get? What extent of resistance are you going to get? I want to note again, why is the type of resistance they get, even if they manage to get it to the extent that they claim they're going to get it, is not necessarily good. Because they claim that life is more important than culture. The sort of life that these individuals will live and the type of resistance that you get as a result are going to be lives of assimilation, subordination. If they want to question us, why is it worth it to sacrifice your family's lives and the lives of those most proximate to you for the sake of your culture? The reason is because the death of your identity means the feeling that you have conceded to your oppressor, means that your children and your children's children children are forced to live in this form of subordination. If you were an individual, a colonized individual in Malaysia in the 1940s, I highly doubt that you would tell yourself that this is better than freedom. I would love for my kids to live here rather than me die fighting to try, right? But lastly, we introduced the idea of presidents. The idea that how much you should fight will be redefined by this narrative. We give examples such as Luigi Mangione being okay with the repercussions of what he's done, allegedly, because he knows that it's worth it when you fight against capitalism. They are largely unengaged with this. The reason why this narrative is the tipping point for resistance, not just in the worst case scenarios, but even in these liberal states where individuals are being oppressed by things such as capitalism, is because it actively mitigates the worst form of oppression, bringing me to my last clash on who facilitates oppression more, and why is their whole argument on this co-option by these oppressors not necessarily important. No, like I said before, these countries like the US are going to bomb Iraq for the sake of democracy anyways. They will always be able to posit that their culture concedes you. The internal calculus in which you believe that, hey, maybe I shouldn't just believe that everything that the West sees is necessarily the best course of action for every country on the face of the planet can only occur in our world. The idea that you should not default to what these oppressors say are moral, that your lives matter. That your culture matters more than your life because you are willing to fight for it. These are exclusive benefits that we have posited here today. I'm fine, I will trade off that maybe some people will fight more over nasi lemak. I don't think these people on Twitter are necessarily going to be hurt that bad in comparison to the number of lives lost in that world, both in terms of agency, culture, and national identity themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Gauri, for that speech. Thanks everyone for that excellent debate. Please cross the floor, shake hands while the judges deliberate.